Out of this emerges, I think, a political project of the U.S. British oligarchs joined by the European Central Bank and their followers in Japan, which comes down to this. The International Monetary Fund will be made into the center of a world economic dictatorship. Back in the 1920s and 30s, Lord Montague Norman of the Bank of England was called the currency dictator of Europe. Well, this time around, the currency dictator of the world is Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the former finance minister of France, who is the boss of the International Monetary Fund, and within that same orbit, you've got the World Bank and a series of other institutions. And the way they want to do this is to make the IMF the central bank of all central banks. So we have the Federal Reserve, bad enough, European Central Bank, extremely bad, Bank of Japan, also bad, but above them, yet another layer of oligarchical power plastered on top of the Fed, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan is the IMF, with regulatory capabilities, but also as a lender of last resort to the national central banks. Let's assume we had a panic run on the Federal Reserve. Perfectly feasible. It already happened in 1932 to 1933 when you had the great Herbert Hoover U.S. banking crisis. There were a lot of banks who were members of the Federal Reserve who had put money in and wanted to get it out. And if that had continued through 1933, you would have had a panic run on the Federal Reserve. So now what we've got is the idea of the IMF being able to come in as the lender of last resort for national central banks, except you don't get that money from the IMF for free. If the IMF gets on your case, you are required to sign a letter of intent in which you express your commitment to observe the conditionalities of the IMF. And they have a very specific economic doctrine. It's called the Washington Consensus, and that is deregulation, privatization, the destruction of your social safety net. It would mean union busting. If you have a state sector, they want to destroy that. They want to have the race to the bottom across the board. Now, what happens if the U.S. goes bankrupt and has to turn to the IMF for loans? At that point, U.S. sovereignty ceases to exist, and you're going to have Dominique Strauss-Kahn or some similar cosmopolitan finance oligarch sitting in Washington, because here's where the IMF is, but imposing a worldwide financial dictatorship on the U.S. with, of course, the British having the inside track to the kind of stuff that gets done. Most people are not aware that among its many crimes, and this is one of the worst crimes, the Obama regime has transferred 100 billion U.S. dollars to the International Monetary Fund. At the same time that California was collapsing, Illinois was going to hell, New York was facing bankruptcy, and communities across the nation were experiencing tremendous hardships. Obama finds $100 billion for the IMF. Now, what do they do with that? The currency for the new world finance dictatorship is already there. It's special drawing rights, SDRs. This is something that emerged after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, after Nixon destroyed Bretton Woods with British assistance in August 15th, 1971. They created special drawing rights. They called it paper gold. Of course, it's not gold. At the beginning, it was a basket of currencies. That has evolved. It's a purely paper creation. You can go to the website of the International Monetary Fund any day, and you will see all of the currencies of the world expressed as SDRs in terms of special drawing rights. So that's your supranational currency, and the U.S. has already given $100 billion to prop that up. And that's in the program of $1 trillion that has been pledged by the other main financial powers, by the Japanese, the Europeans, and others. So they're hoping to stock up on $1 trillion total in various currencies and use that as reserves to back up the special drawing rights. Now, there's nothing worse than this. The mentality of this IMF is called the Washington Consensus. They have no success stories to point to. they always fail. They always increase poverty, increase economic backwardness, shut down industries, increase unemployment, and so on down the line. From Bolivia to Poland to Russia in the 1990s. IMF shock therapy is widely regarded as economic death. Argentina, a couple of years ago, owed the IMF $10 billion, and they realized the only way to get their economy in order was to get out from under the IMF, get the IMF out of their country, off their case. So President Kirchner of Argentina borrowed $10 billion from Chavez of Venezuela to pay off the IMF and get them out. Countries are generally much better off borrowing from another country, from a peer, rather than borrowing from this overreaching, overarching, supranational, dictatorial empire that comes in and tells you what to do. This has gone so far that the Washington consensus is being widely rejected. Nobody wants to go under this. There's now the Beijing consensus. And the Beijing consensus goes like this. First of all, don't interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign states. And we want that for ourselves. We better give it to others. And the second point is 50-50, everything equal. No overwhelming advantage for one side or the other. So the special drawing rights is what is happening. There are other hypothetical options, fallback options, back burner options, regional currencies and things like this. But what is actually going on in the world, and what you've given $100 billion for, is special drawing rights, SDRs.